Hello, everybody. Josh Neighbors here, Locked On Big 12 podcast. It's the 18th of January, 2023. Special edition here, recording right after the news broke that Kendall Briles is going to be the new TCU offensive coordinator, replacing Garrett Riley. So, going to share some thoughts on this situation on Briles returning, because this is not just an offensive coordinator hire at TCU. There's a lot going into it. Kind of want to give you guys my initial thoughts on this TCU situation and was this the right move, for non-football reasons and football reasons, all that coming up.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Once again, Josh Neighbors here, Locked On Big 12 podcast. Make sure you guys subscribe to the channel. You guys can do so by just hitting the subscribe button on YouTube. Also, find us wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify. Please follow us on Twitter at LOBig12, and you guys can find me at JoshNeighbors_. We will have basketball coverage coming. I'm going to go Thursdays now because most Big 12 games are Tuesdays and Thursdays, or Tuesdays and Wednesdays. So we'll have kind of our thoughts on Thursdays and then some preview stuff happening on Fridays, and we'll mix in some Mondays. So going to go going probably half and half football, basketball here, as still things are wrapping up with football season, transfer portal closing, staff movements obviously still happening right now. We still have some of our season recaps. Oklahoma came out today. You guys can check that out. UCF earlier this week. We're going to be doing Houston and Texas. We'll have those coming up for you guys. Also K-State as well. And TCU in a little bit. We'll talk to Steven Simcox probably next week, because that's where we go tonight. And this story has a lot of layers to it, but TCU reportedly is going to hire Kendall Briles to be their offensive coordinator to replace Garrett Riley. Garrett Riley left TCU this year to go take the job at Clemson, where it looks like, he is on the fast track to becoming a head coach sometime in the near future. Kendall Briles comes over from Arkansas. Now, not just Arkansas. Kendall Briles' coaching history goes back to his time where he played football, obviously Texas and then Houston, safety and wide receiver. And then he was the inside wide receivers coach. And then was ultimately promoted to OC and offensive coordinator in 2015 and 2016. Went to FAU in 17, Houston in 18, FSU in 19. Then 2020 through 2023, he was at Arkansas as the offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach. They were set to bring him back. And now he takes the job at TCU. The reason why this is surprising, it's a multiple kind of sided issue, but the number one thing is with what happened at Baylor, it is going to be awkward to have Kendall Briles back in the conference. And for those of you who don't know, Kendall Briles is the son of Art Briles, the former Baylor head coach, who left amid scandal, and everything that happened basically at Baylor University was there is a sexual assault scandal that involved the coaching staff, people in the program, the president, AD, everybody, and just gross negligence with what the football players were doing. Sexual assault and rape was involved, and it was a pretty comprehensive situation. I mean, really, it shelled Baylor's football program. We know that they had to tear that thing down and then kind of rebuilt it pretty fast. But we all know that thing got torn down, and a lot of folks were caught up in that. Obviously, Oklahoma offensive coordinator Jeff Lebby, Kendall Briles, Art Briles, Kaz Kazadi, the strength and conditioning coach, was involved. And look, there is some varying reporting about, the extent of Kendall Briles' involvement in that situation. And the lawsuit claims that, he was pretty involved in kind of the show him a good time culture there about, offering up, women to players and asking players if they liked certain kinds of, women of a certain race, stuff like that. Just stuff that's really inappropriate for a coach to do, especially, as the kind of time goes along now. It's just inappropriate way to act, because it kind of, represents a culture. We say, hey, these women, they're really into football players. Are you into that? You give kids the wrong message, because then they start assuming all these women are into football players, and that all of them, all of a sudden they have consent to do whatever they want because you've been told that they're into it. And it's just kind of creating a a bad culture overall. So like his involvement specifically, we don't know all the way. There's been a lot written on it. And I think Kendall Briles and Jeff Lebby have both been, I want to use the word victim, but they have been, obviously they've been dinged for what happened. And so some of you out there might be believers that, you should move on and you should forgive and whatnot. Kendall Briles and Jeff Lebby were pretty outspoken supporters of Art Briles during that situation. Obviously, both family members. Lebby marries into the family, Briles being the son, Kendall Briles that being. And so, you kind of have to question the amount of contrition coming there, because the thing is, like, Kendall Briles can move around as much as he wants. And I think there's always a process whenever Lebby gets hired or Briles gets hired. We saw what happened. Art Briles was hired for a day at Grambling State and whatnot. But if you bring Kendall Briles back to the Big 12 and not just back to the Big 12, to TCU, whose biggest rival is Baylor, if he's here for more than, and we haven't seen the schedule yet, but if he's here for more than a year, there's a very good chance that he will be coaching a game back at Baylor University, which could set up an incredibly awkward and upsetting situation for some folks to see him back in a role that he had before that school, but in a different school, obviously, but to be back in that kind of position of authority and power. And, it's really curious because I know Gary Patterson is no longer the coach at TCU, but it's well documented that TCU and Baylor, rivals, but Art Briles and Gary Patterson did not necessarily get along very well. Not two guys that, really had a lot of love for each other, and kind of, ended up kind of being curmudgeons almost in very much different ways. I have a lot more respect for Gary Patterson than I do for one Art Briles, based off of what I know about, based on what we all know about both of those guys. It also begs the question too, for TCU, Brandon Marcello, I just heard him speak on Big 12 radio on Sirius XM. He said, look, there is already booster backlash. We know that. There is going to be fan backlash. And it's interesting that Sonny Dykes would choose to spend goodwill and capital that he has gained through the success of his first year in making a hire like this. Now, Kendall Briles is a pretty good offensive coach. We've seen the offenses that he had at FAU. I know Arkansas fans were not always pleased with his performances, but still, that was an awesome offense for a lot of the time. I didn't feel like the Arkansas offense always was the big issue for the Hogs. He had a lot of success during his time coaching. And so for him to decide to leave an SEC school, they're paying him a heck of a lot of money, and to come to TCU, I think speaks volumes of where that program is. It speaks volumes of what people think of Sonny Dykes as kind of a guy who can make you, in the coaching business, right? It feels like Garrett Riley is well on his way to becoming a made man in the coaching ranks. And so now this all just kind of, I want to say it's all kind of like Sonny Dykes is spending the capital. He is absolutely putting himself out there. Now, some folks might think once spring football kicks up and around, we start getting to the ball, and if they start winning, it'll all go away. But this is a pretty deep-rooted rivalry. This is two schools that, they stand for Christianity ostensibly, because Baylor's a Baptist school and TCU, obviously Texas Christian University, right? So they stand for, pillars of different pillars, I guess you could say, the same faith, right? And kind of that faith-based idea. I don't know if Sonny Dykes really claimed that. I don't really see him claim that a whole lot. Not in the way like a Scott Drew does, I guess, not as much of a guy who talks about, I guess, faith as much, whatever. It just feels interesting that this is where you want to spend your chips. This is where you want to put your political capital. This is where you want to put the goodwill that you've earned through that strong season. And you want to spend it on Kendall Briles. Now, you might say, Josh, well, there aren't that many good options around. And look, if Kendall Briles is available, he is a good fit, a guy to go and get and run a system that Sonny is familiar with, and two guys that have some pretty good synergy. The coaching fit seems like it makes a lot of sense. I know there's some situations where there are Arkansas fans specifically were upset with some stuff that Kendall Briles would do, but generally speaking, he helped KJ Jefferson and that offense reach some pretty impressive heights. And I think that coaching wise, it makes a lot of sense, but this is not the move I would have made. Say, well, what would you have made? I can't tell you the exact answer that I'm not as plugged in, not as connected. A lot of these coaching guys are, but this was what you had to do. Like, is this the move you had to make to guarantee offensive success? There was nobody else in the air raid tree that you could go and find, in the Baylor offensive tree, whatever you want to say. There's nobody else that you could go and get to push this thing forward, to keep the program moving forward. I have a difficult time believing that. Maybe Sonny Dykes just didn't care about all that. And he's like, you know what? If Kendall Briles is allowed to coach back in Power 5 football, why can't he coach here? Why can't he coach for me? And why can't he help us succeed? I understand that. But Sonny's intimately familiar with TCU and SMU and in that area. And he's an air raid guy too. So like Sonny understands all this stuff. And that's why I am a little surprised. Angry? No, I mean, I think the anger and whatnot is like, I'll save that for TCU fans, however you all want to feel. I have made my feelings about hiring people like this. We talked about Chris Beard last week. Like, I don't care how reformed that guy says he is. I would not be the AD to hire him. I would not be the AD to hire Hugh Freeze. I would not be the AD to hire Kendall Briles. I would not be an AD who would hire Art Briles. All of those things. And I really, even Jeff Lebby to some extent, like I wouldn't be that guy. Maybe I wouldn't be an AD for too long because I'm being too morally altruistic. Sure, whatever you want to say about that, but that's just me. That's who I am. That's where I'm coming from. I don't claim to take the moral high ground. That's not what I'm trying to do there. I'm just saying, like, I'd like to think that at some point with our college sports, like, when people say they want to mold young men and create good people, they actually mean what they say. They actually are trying to forge forward and create a good situation for those young men, set a good example, because it sounds like from everything that we know, Briles, plural, were not setting a good example. And at no point was, it was not a culture of accountability for your wrongdoings. It was covering up, showing kids it's okay to do, pretty heinous things allegedly and get off with it. So that is why, I would not be somebody, I'm not like excited about this hire. I'm not jazzed about this hire for TCU. I think it's going to be uncomfortable to see Kendall Briles back in the Big 12. I think it's going to be uncomfortable to see Kendall Briles in the same field as the Baylor Bears, which, it's a big rivalry. And I think even with whatever happens with the schedule, I think we will see Baylor against TCU next year. I think that's going to be pretty obvious. Like, it's a rivalry you're probably going to keep. So I'm not comfortable with that. Obviously I'd love to hear what you all think in the comment section below, but I think this is when you guys do comment, when you all do talk about this, I would say, be thoughtful and be careful about what you all say, because this is not an easy issue. Like, this did not personally affect a lot of us, but there are people out there who it did personally affect. And, I think you think, like, do you want them to read or hear anything you say about this situation? And Kendall Briles has asked multiple times, try to separate himself from his father, asked him to be judged on him. But, some of the stuff that we've heard doesn't mean, like, it doesn't sound like Kendall should be separated completely from what happened there, especially some of the stuff that we read in the lawsuit. And it does not sound like it was a situation, where people were just making stuff up and trying to sink Baylor athletics. Right. This is also Baylor athletics president goes on, I think president or AD, I forget which one, goes on to Baylor and goes and hires Hugh Freeze there just after his situation that happened at Ole Miss. So these are not always good faith actors. There are bad people in college athletics. I think we like to believe that all these folks come out and say, we want to help these young men grow. We help these student athletes succeed in the classroom, life, all of those things, and grow as men and women. But like, that stuff is not always true all the time. And sometimes the bottom line is winning. But where do you go too far with that? Where does that become too far? Where does your desire to win begin to hurt people? Because they did at Baylor. People got hurt. Just absolutely, like, irrevocably hurt at Baylor because winning was all that mattered. Protecting players and creating a very bad environment, environment that I guess the players, could thrive in a horrible fashion, was what they were trying to do. So I think I think the decision to have this move happen right now also shows they were trying to avoid any potential transfers from either direction, right? They were trying to avoid a situation where, Arkansas players might leave because Kendall is gone, or TCU players might leave because Kendall Briles is coming in, whatever you guys want to say about that. So those are my initial thoughts on this. We'll talk with Steven Simcox. Obviously, it's an interesting situation because these two schools' history. We'll talk to also our buddy Drake Toll over at Locked On Baylor. But, I would say trepidation is my first thought about having Kendall Briles back in the Big 12. Surprised that Sonny Dykes would go for Kendall Briles considering the history. It is a bold move for sure. It's not one of those where if it pays off, like Kendall Briles does not score any brownie points for scoring a ton of points, if you will, right? Like the move is the move. It'll be a good hire based off of their success and their results, which now have a really high standard, but the move is the move. I think it is surprising. It is kind of going to be upsetting for some folks. I mean, I can't begin to fathom how the Baylor folks are going to feel to see that guy potentially back in Waco and when he steps foot at McLean Stadium. So I think there's a whole lot to consider here. Make sure you follow us on Twitter at LOBig12. You guys can follow me at JoshNeighbors_. You guys can find the show wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube as well. Till next time, my friends, as always, stay safe.